Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello, and welcome to Reimagining Motion, a podcast from the High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, which is undertaking research into the complex and interrelated issues of sustainable transport across Africa and South Asia. I'm Holger Dirkmann, your host for today's session. Welcome. In our first series, we are exploring transit-oriented development, or TOD. In urban planning, TOD is a type of development that can enable residents to live closer to jobs and services and reduce the time and environmental burden of transport and also boost economic growth. It has become a leading trend for urban planning in recent decades, particularly in high-income countries. In this series, we are talking to TOD experts from our HVT research program and explore the nature of TOD, whether it can be beneficial to low-income countries, how it might be implemented, but also what the barriers are. Each episode draws on the latest HVT research, case studies, and newly developed frameworks, offering insights and practical ideas for a TOD approach. In our episode today, we'll focus on data to better understand and plan for transit and for TOD. We're seeing huge urban growth in many low-income countries, but what does this mean in terms of urban planning for those heading into the cities to have a good quality of life and to support sustainable growth? One of the key aspects to knowing the situation in these rapidly growing cities and how to plan is having the right data. So let me welcome our guest, Philip Krause. Hi, Philip. How are you doing today?
Very good in yourself, Holger. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So where are you in the world, Philip?
I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa.
Okay, fantastic. So great to have you, and thanks for coming. So let me briefly introduce yourself before we actually get started. So Philip is a transport engineer and project manager of Krause, who's working on the African Urban Mobility Observatory, or AUMU, which is using telecommunication-based technologies to support the collection and analysis of mobility data across sub-Saharan African cities to promote low-carbon mobility. And Philip, you have to tell me later about how to pronounce this AUMU. So again, welcome. So starting also with urban planning. So Africa is urbanizing pretty rapidly, more and more people coming also into the cities. So what do you see as the biggest challenge for Africa when it comes to coping with that and comes to urban planning, and how to manage that and how to move forward?
I think it's a very complex matter, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges that the various cities face across sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a complex matter and I think that the solutions will vary from city to city. But one of the key challenges that makes urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa unique compared to perhaps developed parts of the world is that a lot of the people moving into the urban areas are from low-income backgrounds and are not able to afford to necessarily live in areas of the city that have better access to opportunities. So I think the critical steps to be taken are to recognize, or for governing authorities to recognize that they need to ensure that these people who are moving into their cities are able to somehow, access the opportunities and ensure that the growth and the spatial patterns that emerge as a result of the increased urbanization leads to more efficient transport land use interrelationships. So
you speak about also transport and the integration of land use and transport, and as this podcast is about also TOD, what do you see as the opportunities but also the challenges, particularly also for Africa, and you also live in South Africa, so you said. So where do you see also how to also bring this idea forward?
So I think one of the advantages that should be leveraged to the extent that it can be is that while it is unfortunate that many of these lower income residents are captive users to public transport, they are nevertheless public transport users and NMT users. NMT is non-motorized transport. So that would include cycling, walking, and to some degree, even e-bikes, even though those do have motors, but often they are considered to be part of the NMT domain. And that means that while the trajectory is moving towards private automobiles, there is an opportunity to ensure that as they are able to become choice users, that public transport remains attractive. So it's a very different situation to developed world cities, especially the more sprawling cities in the US, where automobile adoption is pretty much a given, and trying to attract those choice users out of their cars and into public transport, at least in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, the mode share already is heavily tilted towards or leaning towards public transport and NMT.
Thanks. So overall, what we have learned, or I've learned so far on also TOD for Africa, there is a huge potential and is a need, in fact, of the integration of transport and land use. We have with public transit and so many users also the opportunity also to make that viable. At the same time, we have to include really also affordable housing and provide those incentives, as well as also the better collaboration also between governments. So now as moving towards your main key area you're working now on, data. So, but let's talk about those data in the context and of TOD. So tell us about a little bit more about this. What are you doing, and what are actually the benefits of collecting those data?
So on the ORMO project, and some people say ORMO, some people say ALMU, and there's many other variations that I've heard as well, and it really doesn't matter as long as you know it, as long as everyone is on the same page about what we're talking about, then it's fine. One of the key objectives was to collect data using a range of new survey techniques to try and reduce the cost of data collection. Because data collection, of course, it's important to understand what the status quo is. You need to, before you can start investing in and planning for improvements, you need to know what you're improving and where the pinch points are and where the various challenges might lie, so that you know where to prioritize often very limited budgets. So we collected data, or we developed a series of data collection tools specifically for this project, and that's with the idea being that they would be, could be used moving forward and replicated in future by other planners. One of the data collection instruments that we used was just the conventional surveys, where enumerators on the ground intercepted passers-by and asked them a series of multiple choice questions. And then another instrument that we used was USSD, or unstructured supplementary services data messages, which is essentially it's a GSM-based communication protocol, which allows low-end mobile devices. So I'm talking about devices from, anytime from the mid-90s till present, really. It basically allows low-end mobile devices to communicate with a server. So you're able to emulate, to some extent, a survey that otherwise you would require internet connectivity to conduct. And that just means that in terms of your sample, because we're dealing with a context where I wouldn't say very few people have smartphones, it is increasing rapidly, but very few people have smartphones that they have data connectivity on permanently or are willing to use their data. So we needed to find an instrument that have a very wide reach. We also conducted surveys via WhatsApp, and then also a smartphone-based technology that we developed in-house called user movement analytics.
So bring that back also to the TOD. What kind of give us a flavor of what kind of data you actually collected, and how is that actually useful for planners, for developers?
The data that we collected 3 axes of indicators, or data that informed 3 axes of indicators rather. And in terms of TOD, the ones which are most relevant are the mobility indicators, which looked at travel time, accessibility, and mode share, amongst others. And another aspect of the project was to develop a web platform which allows the visualization of the data that we've collected, so that a planner is able to see where there are hotspots or difficulties in accessing opportunities in various parts of the city and where travel times are high. So to answer your question, essentially, the data is necessary in order to understand if you want to use TOD principles, you need to know where are people actually wanting to go at present, where are people coming from, so that you don't end up duplicating existing opportunity or relying on new opportunities emerging, but rather leverage what you have and reorient your development patterns by retrofitting TOD rather than starting something new.
Thanks, Philip. And for our listeners, we should also highlight that also the link also to the web platform, which I understood is quite complex, is in fact also in our description. On AUMO, you had 6 cities you worked also closely with. So I guess also as Africa is also so diverse and the city are so diverse, can you share a little bit of observations of the challenges and also opportunities also for those?
Sure. So the 6 cities were Blantyre, Gaborone, Kigali, Kinshasa, Lagos, and Maseru. And as you might recognize, they're quite diverse in terms of the size of the city, the population densities, and also the regions in which they are, and their GDPs. So one of the things we looked at was the paratransit services which were operating in these cities, and the big difference was, for example, with the comparative cities of Blantyre and Kigali, which are the 2 action plan cities, and we can speak more about that in a bit. But essentially, Kigali have a situation where there has been much paratransit reform, and paratransit or minibus taxis have been replaced by formalized bus services. Whereas in Blantyre, the opposite is true. There's no formal public transport services, and all public transport trips are served by informal paratransit. So by reviewing or conducting this research across so many different cities and environments, we were able to see what are the reform strategies that have worked in some cities, where are the opportunities for reform in other cities, and are those reforms actually necessary or not?
So, thanks, Philip. How can data also help us with the reform? And can you give us an example on what happened? So you had just a workshop in Kigali. So how move things forward in AUMO?
Yeah, so we had a workshop in both Blantyre and Kigali as the 2 action plan cities. One of the deliverables on this project is to co-develop action plans with the municipalities of 2 of the cities from the long list of 6. And we chose Blantyre and Kigali as the final cities to work with, since they were the most engaged in this project throughout. So in terms of the key findings, one of the exercises that we went through in the Kigali workshop was to review the indicators that had been pre-selected and determine whether they were context appropriate, whether perhaps there's certain realities in Kigali that differ from other cities that make the definitions of the indicators perhaps not quite appropriate. So one of the indicators that raises a concern was that regarding accessibility. Accessibility we defined as the time it takes to access public transport services. Now, I think in any city, really, it's, accessibility is much more complex than that, especially when looking at, in the context of TOD, accessibility is about access to opportunities. So whether that be access to healthcare, to employment opportunities, education, basically any opportunity that you might want to access, that's what you really want to be measuring, not whether you can access transport, because transport ultimately is just the conduit to access that opportunity. So there definitely needs to be some work in terms of the way these indicators are defined, and the limitation of the reason the indicator was defined in that way was really because we were trying to ensure that the indicators would link well with the data collection techniques that we're using. We're using several different data collection techniques, some more capable than others. So we had to ensure that there was compatibility between them, because all the data needed to be uploaded into a single database and be comparable. So there is definitely a need for work there.
This project is all about also data collection, but also data analysis. Finally, this project also needs to work also with local players and to be also picked up. So how is you ensure that this is not just a database put on a website, which is then also not used? So how did you work, and how are you working also with also like your local partners?
So from the very start of the project, we've been working with stakeholders locally, and that includes stakeholders from the private sector, as well as from the public sector. So in terms of public sector stakeholders, we've been, for example, in Kigali, we've been working with City of Kigali officials throughout the project, and they've been involved in all the steps that we've been through, at least in terms of getting the necessary permissions to collect the data, but also we've informed them about how we engage with the private sector stakeholders to achieve the objectives of those various campaigns that we ran. So our intention was to transfer the knowledge that we gained through the course of this project to the public officials, so that moving forward, they can continue to take advantage of some of these novel data collection techniques that we've developed.
The other issue often also when we talk about also data is privacy, and the question, are my data so secure and are they not being also misused? So how did you make sure that this is not the case in your project and the initiative?
Yes, so data privacy is obviously a very sensitive matter, and it did pose interesting challenges throughout. Of course, this project, it's a GDPR compliant project, which means that there were certain logical steps which we had to follow, which helped to simplify the process of ensuring that we respected and protected people's privacy. But one of the key decisions that we took was to essentially, avoid collecting personal data as far as possible through all the various survey technologies. So while this was very easy for the case of intercept surveys, we simply just didn't ask people for any personally identifiable data such as locations or cell phone numbers or names or ID numbers. When it comes to the technology-based survey instruments, some personal information collection or data collection becomes unavoidable. For example, with USSD and WhatsApp surveys, you will always have access to the person's cell phone number, which is personal data. And then when we move on to the smartphone-based application, the user movement analytics, there we're actually collecting live location data. So what is important though is, per GDPR, informed consent is required, which means that you need to communicate to the prospective respondent what the purpose of the data collection is, how the data will be used, and how it might benefit them, and essentially making it clear to them that their participation is completely voluntary and that they can opt out at any time. So for all the different data collection methods, we ensured that we disclosed the rights of the user so that they would know whether or not they would be informed, and they would know whether they really want to participate, so they didn't feel coerced to participate. And we just ensured that when it came to the smartphone-based app, we ensured that we included prompts and screens that would take the prospective user through a sequence that would ensure that they really were giving consent for the data that we were wanting to collect from them. And then finally, in terms of the way the data is presented on the web platform, the data that's accessible to the general public and to public officials is aggregate data. So all that personally identifiable data, such as the live location data, is not accessible through that platform. That is aggregated and turned into, or informs indicators to draw useful data from the raw data, but the raw data itself is kept safe and completely separate.
Fantastic. So what I learned so far is, in fact, 5 things. Data collection is crucial to plan particular with indicators like modal split, but also indicators like access, where also more work needs to be done to get really also the information needed for TOD planning. The indicators need to adapt to the local needs. Data collection techniques have to brought also together, and here in that example is really also on one platform. Important also to have the capacity and to create also the ownership of data collection and analysis locally, as well as ensuring also the privacy of the data. So thanks a lot also, Philip, for all that information. Just a closing question. If you now also look forward also to the year 2030, so what is your vision in terms of particular integrated transport and land use planning, TOD, and how to make that vision happen in the next 8 years, particularly so the role of data here? What do we need to do?
So I think looking at 2030, essentially it's a matter of really identifying how to make the most of limited budgets in terms of retrofitting TOD principles to existing development patterns, to try and encourage affordable housing in central areas by putting in place inclusionary housing policies, and really ensuring that automobile-oriented development, such as, in terms of improving the experience of private vehicle users, is any budget which is available should not be spent on that. It should be spent on public transport infrastructure and NMT infrastructure.
Fantastic. Thanks again, also, Philip, and thank you for listening also to this episode. If you would like to find out more about the work of our guest and any of the resources, please check out the links in the description. I also encourage you to listen to the other episode in the series where we explore a variety of other topics related to transit-oriented development. Also, you can leave us a rating and review. It really helps others find our podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about the high volume transport, you can check out our website, transport-links.com, or follow us on Twitter under @transport_links, or on LinkedIn at High Volume Transport Applied Research Program. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, HVT, is an £18 million investment by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. The program's new body of research aims to help inform the decisions of policymakers in low-income countries and make road and rail transport greener, safer, and more accessible and affordable. My name is Holger Delkmann, and you have been listening to Reimagining Motion. Thank you very much. Stay and travel safe wherever you are. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen.